right, my AP language friends. So Kristian Kuhn coming at you again with a writing workshop, also affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And in this writing workshop video, I have FRQ1 from the 2023 exam, vertical farming. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next half hour or so is vertical farming. So what I'll do is this, we'll break down the prompt together. And then I'll Bob Ross how to do some introductory paragraphs. I have some declarative and inverted theses for you, and those are the two templates I use to house the thesis. So inverted and declarative method. And then as always, we'll stick to the status quo and tackle those body paragraphs syllogistically. And just for fun, I got a couple of conclusion paragraphs for you as well. So sit tight and I will cobble this whole essay together for you from start to finish while using my templates, the whole kit and caboodle of my templates. So let's break down the prompt together. So my students came back from the exam center and said that they did quite well on this, and it's very accessible. So the prompt says, vertical farms are indoor agricultural facilities in which plants are grown, often in a hydroponic, soilless environment on tall stacks of shelves. Plants are given water, nutrients, and light mostly through automated processes. Advocates say that vertical farms are key to providing food for the future, yielding high quality produce while making efficient use of land and water. Critics, on the other hand, warn about the energy consumption associated with vertical farms, automated processes, as well as problems related to cost and nutritional value. So with regards to vertical farming, we have to say yay, nay, or qualify it. That's pretty much it. So the rest of the directions state this, right? This is kind of the tacit paragraph of the prompt for every FRQ1. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3. So that's really important. Students need to incorporate 3 of the sources that develops your position on the value, if any, of vertical farms to the future of agriculture. So one of the things I always tell my students is this. The College Board is very clear in articulating the idea of make your argument central. So I tell my students in the articulation of the thesis in the introductory paragraph, make sure you're not piggybacking or stealing somebody else's thesis statement from those 6 sources. It has to be authentically you. But how do we get kids to do this? So I'm going to show you exemplars that my students wrote, and you're going to see what they write like in May. So I inherit my kids the day after Labor Day, and I have them all the way till the end of June. And I do something called Bob Rossing my instruction. So I'm that quirky guy who asked the question, what if we taught composition like Bob Ross teaches painting? And here's what that looks like. Teachers position themselves as the expert writer in the classroom, just like Bob Ross was the expert painter. And you get to the proverbial easel and canvas and you paint with your students with the use, here's the caveat, with the use of templates. Bob Ross used a heuristic, also known as a template, called the wet on wet technique every single time he executed a natural landscape. And my students know, whether they're doing synthesis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, literary analysis, and even research, you can always declare or invert the thesis in the introductory paragraph, and every single body paragraph you ever write, regardless of expository mode, you can bust out the syllogistic method. So I, for the whole academic year, have been the Bob Ross of composition up until March 1st, and then I ceased to be it because I can't go to the exam with them. So I expect my students to be wholly independent of me come March 1st. And most of them, relatively are. My workhorses definitely are. And they don't need me anymore. So let's take a look at what my students are doing. But first, just like your students, they'll sit at the exam center with a blank screen or a blank sheet of paper, and they'll intuitively ask themselves this question after reading the prompt. So, how do I write the introductory paragraph? My students intuitively, instinctually, habitually know the answer to that question. For synthesis, argument, and persuasion, it's a 50-50 coin flip. You can either declare the thesis or invert it. Let me break down both templates for you. So the first is the declarative. And what we'll do if we declare is literally declare the thesis. So we begin with the thesis. Our stance with regards to vertical farming, boom, drop it right in that first sentence as declaratively as possible. From there, you're going to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background. There's no paraphrasing of the sources. There's no quoting of the sources. There's no mention of the sources because our argument's going to be central. It's just background and context with regards to the argument. And then for those that are familiar with my work, you know that I run intensive word study academies and nuance academies with my students. And I do this with my National Writing Project courses too when I teach teachers. So the Word Study Academy is based on this premise. There's a seismic vocabulary void on September 7th when I inherit my students, and it grows exponentially each and every year that I teach. So me as the classroom teacher has to do something to help students augment their vocabulary. So I have intensive word study academies. It's hundreds of activities that I do over the academic year to get students to have a huge bevy of tier 2 level words. And what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT caliber words. So when we look at my students' writing, pay attention to their vocab. I tell them to be their academic best. I don't want them to sound goonish or pretentious or contrived. I really disabuse my students of the notion that if they use $1 million words, that it's the equivalent of good writing. No. You have to cop an academic tone. Right? You have to be your academic best, but you don't want to overdo it. And then sentence constructs is an idea that I steal from Strunk and White's seminal text called Write It Right. In that, they have something called rule number 18, in which they espouse that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So my students are pretty good with their syntactical maneuvers, and they know how and when to wield various sentence constructs. So typically, a struggling emerging writer will overuse independent clauses in short, simple declarative sentences. So you got that rhythm of da-da, 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 da-da. My kids are going to create music with their sentences here and ultimately try to get voice, rhythm, and flow going in their corner so that as they contend for the sophistication point, they have, their reader can pin their hat on that. Great voice, rhythm, flow. And then always, every single time my students write an introductory paragraph, regardless of the FRQ, regardless of the expository mode, they are going 4 sentences. Now, we can flip that triangle upside down and put it on its head and invert the thesis. And in this case, you're going to end with the thesis. So you might begin with context background. I'm usually not a big fan of hooks and analogies, but the place to do it, if you're going to do it, might be in synthesis, argument, persuasion. I tell my students to steer away from it for lit analysis and rhetorical analysis. But if you got some catchy punchline to drop for a synthesis essay, this might be the place, and you would lead with that. And then you just sprinkle in all the other things, context, background, focus on the tier 2, sentence constructs, 4 sentences. So without further ado, why don't we take a look at what my students are doing here? So I have 3 that I'll share with you, and they're all going to take the same approach pretty much. So either lead with the thesis, end with the thesis, parcel in that context and background, focus on the tier 2, focus on the sentence constructs so that everything is supple in terms of the reading. So here is student number 1. There is a certain incontestable truth that speaks to the absolute necessity of pursuing vertical farming more stridently. While arable land is decreasing, the world's population is on the rise. So that's clearly a thesis statement right there. So this is a perfect example of a declarative. The bottom line is this: Mother Earth simply cannot continue to feed all of her children at the current rate. Something radical must be done to ensure that the citizens of the world have enough food to survive, and these agricultural measures are a certain solution. While the critics of these measures offer up a few valid points, the benefits far outweigh the negatives. So you kind of even can do a hint of a concession in this if you want. And then all you're doing really in the introduction is dropping your seeds for the line of reason. So we know that this student is going to focus a lot on the lack of arable land and the increase of population. So you'll see in a second here, I advise my students to do 4 paragraphs for this: intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So this student already hinted at what her body paragraphs are going to be about, which is pretty cool. So you can see the vocab is up. The sentence structures are very supple and flowy. And one of the little tips of advice I give my students is this: you probably don't want to parallel your sentence constructs, especially in the introduction, right? If you do that, it's kind of the sign of that you're a struggling, emerging writer. Typically, you're not paralleling. So I tell them, don't repeat your sentence constructs in the introduction. And that's just kind of a quick rule of thumb to help them with the voice, the rhythm, and the flow. All right, let's do that again. Let's see how to do that all over again. So we're either going to begin with the thesis, end with the thesis, context, background, tier 2 sentence constructs. Student number 2 steps to the plate and crushes this one. If one is to embrace vertical farming as the panacea to our world's food shortage crisis, they are ignorantly placing their blind faith in a science that renders human beings into veritable guinea pigs. All right, sounds like a thesis statement. Under no circumstances whatsoever should food cultivated in these manners be made accessible to the public without first knowing the ramifications on health, if any at all. All too often, there are claims to trust the science, but the vertical farming proponents need to pump their brakes and exercise a bit of prudence. Not only is there a litany of unknowns, but even from a fiscal standpoint, pursuing these alternative growth options makes zero logical sense. So this student is doing the exact same thing as the first. You can see that you're front loading your body paragraphs through the context and background to establish your line of reasoning. So the first body paragraph, it stands to reason, if we're going to follow this line of reasoning, is going to be about the fact that there's not enough science to know whether or not consuming this food has any health ramifications whatsoever. And then the second body paragraph would be about the fiscal cost of vertical farming, in terms like it's just not worth it from an economic standpoint. So that's what I tell my students to do. Drop your seeds for the line of reasoning in your introductory paragraph, but note what's not in it. So no mention of the sources, right? Because your argument must be central. Do not quote in here in exactly 4 sentences. I like the vocab in this one. Embrace, panacea is really good. Veritable guinea pigs is really nice. And proponents, prudence. And I actually like the colloquial expression of pump their brakes. I really think that that's key to sophistication, is to teeter-totter balance just a little bit. Students don't want to overdo it, but just a little bit, because you got to remember these kids are 16, 17 years old. Just a little bit of vernacular and colloquial to show that you got a pulse and a heartbeat and that you're not some dry, pedantic academic writer. So just a little bit of that every now and then, I think, bodes well when students are contending for the sophistication point. All right. Yes, you can. So students and teachers might be looking at this saying, man, Kristian's templates are hard. These kids are good writers. It takes practice, my friends. We've been doing this all year long. So yes, you can. Teachers, I would encourage you to bust out these templates as early as possible in the academic year, and you Bob Ross for your students. So student number 3 comes to the piece of paper, to the blank screen, and bust out the following introduction. They are either going to declare or invert. Let's see. It is abundantly clear that our earth and its people are in peril. So that sounds like context and background. So I'm going to assume that this writer is going to end with the thesis and give us a classic inverted. But thankfully, human development and scientific development has an answer to pull us forth from the brink of disaster and collapse. Clearly, man cannot survive without adequate food resources, but the truth of the matter is that we've exhausted our natural resources while populations nonetheless continue to rise. As such, science needs to vigorously investigate the viability of vertical farming. So that's from a student who struggled a little bit with me this year, and but they're doing okay. So it seems all right in that. So there's a little bit of word redundancy. It's not as strong as the others, but out of the gate, they definitely get the thesis point beyond a shadow of a doubt. So they have a good foundation upon which to build the rest of the essay. So at this stage of the game, if you're writing with me, if you're hosting a writing workshop, I would pause and to have students work on either writing a declarative or an inverted thesis. And then I would project and share as many as possible, perhaps do a gallery walk, do a peer edit, whatever you wish. But I'm a huge proponent of this idea, this concept. The more writing that students see, the better they become. So have students get comfortable sharing their writing with each other, and that way they can get a sense of the good, the bad, the ugly, and really grow and mature as writers. So our next question is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? Because our intros are done. And you know that I have one answer to this. I stay firm on this. It's my tacit response. Proceed syllogistically. All you need to do is bust out the syllogistic method for this. But what I'll do, because I know some of you are new to me, I'll give a furtive, glance at what the syllogistic method is, and then I'll introduce the template to you, and then we'll break down how to piece together the whole body paragraph element by element while manipulating and pulling the strings of the template. But first, let me give a little background on the syllogistic method. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition, comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd often throw out these big, juicy questions like, what is justice? And then the great philosophical scholars would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle, much like us composition instructors, said, geez, why is it that some students are like so good at articulating their arguments and some are men, some just tank bomb it. They're very discursive and disorganized, and I can't make heads or tails of what they're getting at. And then he had a eureka moment one day. He said, aha, I got it. My really good orators are very computative. They have like a calculation, a certain mathematic formula to their arguments. And he said, I have it. It's called the syllogistic method. And it's when students argue from premise, conclusion. So I'll give you an example here. If I were to say to you, premise number 1, arsenic is deadly, and then say, premise 2, my dog ate arsenic, we all would naturally conclude, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog's going to die. And Aristotle would call that a cogent argument. It's bulletproof logic from top to bottom. And when our students write, we want them to be that lockstep, that locked in, that bulletproof with their logic. But one of the things that students do, especially in synthesis, and I'll make a video of this, just dissecting College Board sample papers. What a lot of students do is only present the second premise, which is the textual support, the quoting and the paraphrasing. They regurgitate the source material. They lose the centrality of their argument, and it just becomes plot summative. They're just like summarizing the sources and retelling the story of the sources. We can't have that, right? Because it's argumentative synthesis. So let's look at my template for the purposes of performing argumentative synthesis. The first premise is essential, and I'll model how to do this very carefully for you. The first premise is an argument containing a why reason. So be mindful of this. Up top in those 3 theses that we looked at, none of the students articulated a why reason. You just say, yes, vertical farming, no vertical farming, or I'm going to qualify vertical farming. You don't get into your reasons why. You hold your reasons for the first premise. And this is going to take 3 sentences. This is an artificial construct to ensure that the student's argument stays central. If you begin to quote and or paraphrase in sentence 1, 2, or 3, I really feel like you lose the centrality of your argument and you're piggybacking the source material too doggedly and you lose the focus of your argument. So I don't have my students quote and or paraphrase until the second premise, which begins the 4th sentence. And that's what you see here. Textual support, teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing, and then the conclusion of the body paragraph. And I really want to be mindful of that. Body paragraphs need to be concluded. So this is the textual analysis, and it's the links, the echoes, the promise. You got to throw it all back to the prompt and all back to the thesis. And all of this takes 10 to 12 sentences. I strongly contend that our students that write those 4 or 5 sentence bagger paragraphs, they preclude themselves from getting the sophistication point. You can't have enough support or analysis in 4 to 5 sentences to fully flesh out an argument. So I tell my students to take 10 to 12 sentences. So I talked about that why reason, an argument containing a why reason. How to write the first premise. Let's get that squared away first, and we'll do this piecemeal and do the whole paragraph bit by bit. So the first premise, as I said, is 3 sentences, and I have some stems. They're very artificial, right? They're very prescriptive, and I use these for my struggling and emerging writers. A lot of kids will kick these training wheels off and take the scaffolds down. But for students that are like, I'm a little hesitant, I'm not quite sure how to do this, the easiest stem to make sure that you're articulating a reason why is to say there is a reason why, or there are several reasons why. So you state 1 reason or 2 reasons, however many reasons you need to get to 10 to 12 sentences. So this student begins, there are several reasons why. Your students can steal that if they want it, right? It's a stem. Or there is a single reason why. So you got to decide 1 reason or you go 2 reasons, enough to get 10 to 12. So let's see where this student goes. There are several reasons why the vertical farming proponents need to exercise a greater degree of prudence. And then I call this the enumerated approach. Do you see how the student says first and then second? So you just list, you enumerate. This is a very easy, and again, it's scaffold, it's training wheel, I get that. But for a beginner writer, an unconfident writer, it's a good training wheel. So look at this. First, the scientific community and key researchers have no idea whatsoever if consuming this food is even safe to eat. Second, the fiscal and environmental costs nullify all possible benefits. So this is really cool. One of the things that I talk about a lot with my first premises is this, that you're making a promise. The first premise is a promise. And this student has made a couple of promises to us. One is that we don't know if consuming this food is healthy. And then second, there's environmental and monetary costs associated with this that don't make it tenable, right? It nullifies the benefits. So what do? All right, let's recap here. The first premise is 3 sentences long, and you have to make a why argument. So what do we do next? We have that written. What are we going to do? I do this, right? This is exactly how I write. I'm opening up the lid of my brain for you. I go quote hunting. I go and get all my quotes. So I need quotes about, the health implications that we don't know. There's not enough science to know if eating this vertical farmed food will have ramifications down the road, and then the cost, both from a monetary standpoint and an environmental standpoint. So if I get those quotes and or paraphrases, it's going to allow me to keep the promise of the first premise. And when I state the promise of the first premise, that's just another way of saying, hey, student, keep your line of reasoning intact from start to finish. So going quote hunting and paraphrase hunting is essential to keep everything locked together. So you're basically the first and the second in the first premise need quotes and or paraphrases, and then you just go in order. So let's look at this student's writing and see what they did in the second premise. So again, second premise begins fourth sentence of the body paragraph. And my students usually just head into some quotes and or paraphrases. Fourth sentence, get into your sources. So this student says, while wide-eyed pundits champion vertical farming as producing tomatoes with enough tang to impress Martha Stewart, the fact of the matter is that no one yet knows if there are any health ramifications from eating such produce. So that comes from source A. And what I like that this student did is they took one of the pro sources. So source A is pro vertical farming, and they used the verbiage against the pro side. And I think that needs to be done to be in contention for sophistication. Use words against the speaker is one really nice thing to do as students are trying to get the sophistication point. So that was well executed. So we got one source in here. It is clear that the world's population is projected to exceed 9.5 million people by the year 2050. That comes from source F. And it is also clear that arable land availability is decreasing over time. Vertical farming is not the panacea to these pressing problems. There are far too many unknowns, and as Kim Severson asked, what will the health outcomes be in 2 generations? Source A. So you can see here, the sources need to be talking to each other. They need to hold hands. They need to sing in unison with each other. So source A, F, and then A again are all chitter-chattering with each other, right? They build upon each other. And again, when you quote, you got to analyze, and you got to sprinkle in a little bit of paraphrasing as well. But let me talk about a template within the template. You may have noticed that the quote transitions are silky smooth here. There's a trick to that. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, so I'll say that again. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational, bracket as needed. So we just quoted here. Let's dig at it a little bit. The answer is simple and frightening. Do you see how the kid immediately answers the rhetorical question? Nobody knows because the science is lacking in perhaps the most critical arena, research on human impact. Expecting unsuspecting citizens to be rats for a huge live experiment is neither good science nor is it ethical. The pros and cons are numerous, and while it is clear that vertical farming uses much less land than traditional methods, and that vertical farms can be built in deserts, high population urban areas, and other places that traditional open field farming, it is clear that this all comes with great cost. Source B. So you can see here, I love when students do this. This kid's going con, right? They're against vertical farming, but they're using pro sources and using the pro sources against that argument. Again, I think that's highly sophisticated. I teach my kids how to do that. And, you can offer concessions, rebuttals, all you want in here. It does not matter. So, all right. Next, we have to ask ourselves, because we're not done, right? We have to ask ourselves, how do we keep that promise? Because we still have that second promise that we mentioned in that enumerated first premise. So let's see here. A simple truism of life is that it requires sunlight. But as paradoxical as it may sound, they're trying to use the sun to replace the sun, which is crazy expensive and environmentally counterproductive. Source D. Aha, student kept the promise of the first premise. We needed a quote and or paraphrase for that. Ever since the beginning of the most basic farming methods, the sun has been free of cost and proven to work really well. So why try to fix it? Source C spells it out clearly. The costs of traditional farming are very low, while the costs of vertical farming are very high. All right, we are cooking in peanut oil, but we got to conclude the thought here, right? I always like it when my students go full circle on a syllogism and throw it all back to the prompt and all back to the thesis. The conclusion of the syllogism usually takes 2 sentences. So this student said, not until this science reveals its science in terms of impact on mankind, it quite simply is not a viable alternative or option. Further, the economic costs likewise cancel out any perceivable benefits. It's not worth it on so many levels. So some of you are astute and might say, but that student took 14 sentences to write that whole syllogism. Rules are rules to be broken sometimes. I usually say 10 to 12 sentences. I'm okay if a student goes over as long as they stay cogent. And this student went over, but they were really, really locked in. They kept the promise of the first premise. The line of reasoning was intact from start to finish, and it was really good. And I liked that. That's really good writing. Vocab up, sentence structure, same as what we were talking about in the introduction. So if you're writing the essay with me, I would pause right here. Teacher, you might want to model a couple of why reasons for your students and just go bit by bit. Write the first premise, make sure everyone's articulated the why reason precisely with the training wheel or without the training wheel, and then go quote hunting and then put it all together, 10 to 12 sentences. But we are not done with our essay. We can't stop at 2 paragraphs, right? We got to do more than that. So the question is, what do I do next? You bust out another syllogism. So there's still things that we can do in this. We could offer concessions. We could offer rebuttals. There's still many angles of this argument that we still haven't explored. So what we're going to do is bust out another syllogism. And what we'll do is have that 3-sentence first premise. We just changed the why reason. And if I use the training wheel in the first body paragraph like that there is a single reason why, or there are several reasons why, then you can't use it for the next body paragraph. That's too, I don't know, that's too devoid of sophistication for sure. So articulate a different why reason. Again, you can do concessions, you can do rebuttals in that paragraph, and just bust it out, 10 to 12 sentences. Write that first premise, go quote hunting, and get your paraphrases all lined up, and just rock out 10 to 12 sentences. All right, so the whole essay is going to be 4 paragraphs long. Intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So let's wrap this essay up and take a look at a conclusion. One thing that my students do is I give them about 10 sentence stems for conclusions. And I always like it when my students end with like a big thematic fireworks display, like the climatic crescendo, and just hammer theme, hammer thesis in about 3 to 4 sentences in the end. One of our sentence stems is this: simply said, comma, and then the student takes off. So you just recap, simply said, comma. So if you want to steal that, steal it. So simply said, given the state of affairs on planet Earth, pursuing vertical farming is a must. While there are some obstacles and setbacks, these pale in comparison to the ginormous benefits this technology can foster. And that would be it for the conclusion, right? So you just wrap it all back, go full circle. So we are at the end of our video. One of the things I always say is this, right? As the Bob Ross of composition, happy teaching and happy writing. Know that if you need to contact me for any reason, you can drop me a line at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Happy to answer any questions. Also know that I am a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, and we do professional development all year long. So one cool thing we have going on this summer is FRQ boot camp. So we're going to do one for AP Lang. and we're also going to do one for AP Lit. We're going to go through all 3 FRQs, my Nuance Academy, my Word Study Academy, and really take a look at how to cobble these essays together using my templates and synthesizing all the other nuanced things that you see going on in my students' writing. So if you want more information on that, you can go to teachingwritingcoach.com. If you go to the tab up top, you'll see a section there called My NWP Courses, and you can see our whole slate of course offerings. So we have alternative grading methods, the FRQ Bootcamp, the Teach It Right 5-week mastermind, and we also have a self-paced course as well, because we know that some of you don't have time to free up for long, lengthy PD sessions. I also will say this, out of all the PD offerings I have seen and that I'm aware of, National Writing Project is very cognizant of keeping prices low. I think for a nominal fee, you get a killer bang for your buck in terms of PD development. I was redundant there. PD, professional development. So that's it from here. Hope you're well. Hope you can use this with your students and that they crush all of their FRQ1s going forward. Take care.